I want to obviously thank the organizers of the conference, Yui Sensei, who contacted me initially and invited me, and also for being part of the network, organizing the network, and Hayami-san for coordinating everything, obviously. And thank you also very much to all the graduate students who made the conference possible. I appreciate your assistance and so on. What I'd like to do today is essentially give you a sense of the framework within which I'll be operating. I'm a sociologist, and by training and perhaps by disciplinary convention, I tend to focus on coming up with general systems, or if you want, models to think through some of these things. And I will do this in a way where I will focus much more on this than on empirical analysis per se. In fact, there's very little empirical analysis. And to add to the perhaps the confusion, I'm not a specialist of manga. I read some manga, but compared to most of you, I know very little about manga itself. So I'm interested in seeing what you have to say. The other warning that I should give you is that the version that I'll be speaking, that I'll be talking through today, is somewhat different from the written version. I'm not very good at sticking to a script, so I will follow the broad lines of what I outlined, but there'll be some changes. I do apologize for this. I realize for those of you who are not English speakers as your first language, it may be a little bit difficult to follow. So what I want to start off with is actually just by presenting, if you want, a kind of mapping out of the field of visual studies that emerges in the social sciences as it has emerged over the last decade or so. And I want to start by simply showing you this particular slide, which is essentially, as the beginning of my paper, a kind of mapping out of the two dominant approaches that have existed within visual analysis today. So a perspective that we could call, that I call internalism, and another one that I will call externalism. And I'm not going to go over each of these because it would take the whole presentation time to do so. But as you can see, internalism is characterized by three particular theoretical approaches: phenomenology, hermeneutics, semiotics. And beside each of these, I've given you corresponding theorists who have advanced theories of the visual, or have somehow related their work to visual analysis corresponding with each of these perspectives. And similarly with externalism, one has social structuralism associated with the work of Voltaire, and processualism with the work of Howard Becker. Now what I want to argue is not that internalism and externalism are useless, but rather that they are incomplete when taken on their own, independently of each other. The problem with internalism is that it tends to focus on the image analytically as a self-contained entity, as something that can stand on its own, and that's often, if you want, self-referential or divorced from its historical, social, political context, which gives sense to the image itself. So in order to correct this, there is the emergence of externalism in the work of, as I said, people like Voltaire and Becker. Now, externalism is very useful because it actually focuses, it fills the gap that internalism could not fill, which is that of focusing on context and social political factors. But in the process of doing that, it loses the very important dimension of analysis which internalism had, which is to say the analysis of the actual meaning and symbolic structure of images themselves that one sees probably most elaborately done in semiotic analysis. So the argument that I want to put forth is that we actually have to bring these two perspectives together, and we have to do so through developing what I'll call a critical sociology of visuality. So let me turn to this. A critical sociology of visuality is essentially a perspective that, as you can see in my first point, that understands visuality not as simply something that is concerned narrowly with the image, but rather as a perspective that thinks about the visual as a set of social relations, a set of practices of production and viewing of images, and a set of discourses about these images. This is a perspective which is partly influenced by the work of W.J.T. Mitchell, which Yui Sensei was also citing yesterday, who's a leading theorist in visual analysis. And part of the argument about a kind of critical sociology of visuality is that we have to think about the mutual constitution of the visual and the social. For those of us who come from the social sciences, the idea that the visual is constituted by the social is rather obvious, which is to say that we understand that images
in all kinds. Still images, moving images are partly influenced by social factors, social context, and social forces. But it's also true to say that the visual partly constitutes the social. And this is an important part, if you want, of thinking through a critical sociology of visuality. Now, when I say the visual partly constitutes the social, what I mean is, in essence, that when we understand the social world, we do so in large part in visual terms. Of course, it's not the only way through which we do so. We do so through oral communication, through written forms of communication, but increasingly today the visual is becoming the dominant medium through which the social is understood and interpreted. So this means, therefore, that we have to take the agentic capacities of images, that is to say, the capacity of images to do things, to make us understand, to make us look at the world differently, seriously. We have to take that dimension of their analysis seriously. We have to look at how the image, in essence, can influence the social and our understanding of the social. Now, in order to do this, and in order to proceed through my analysis, I'm going to propose three key concepts, and you can see those concepts outlined actually it should be, well, this is point 111. It should be 1, 2, 3, but the three, I think this is a PowerPoint, the switch between PC and Macintosh. There was a bit of a lost translation there. I don't think it's actually English to Japanese, I think this is PC to Macintosh. But you can see the three concepts are the concepts, and they're also outlined in the paper that I provide, the concept of symbolic structure, network of circulation, and iconographic field. Now, as those of you who are familiar with the social sciences, the idea of structure, network, and field are very important. The idea of structure obviously comes out of structuralism. The idea of network comes out of partly organizational analysis, but also actor network theory, notably the work of people like Latour. And also the idea of field, which comes out of the work of Bourdieu and some of his followers over the last 2 decades or so. So I want to try to use these concepts that are more abstract concepts in general social theory and apply them to an analysis of the visual. And I want to start by talking about the symbolic structure of images. Now, the key aspect here when we talk about the symbolic structure, and here I'm going to show you a slide. And this is a slide that essentially takes some dimensions of semiotic and structuralist analysis and tries to apply it generally. Now, I would normally be tempted to go directly to the slide, but there's a microphone here, so I don't want to lose my voice while doing so. But essentially what we're talking about here is that what we need to understand is that images in general, when we look at them, do not have a given meaning. The meaning has to be constructed and reconstructed by the audience based on the structure of the image, which is organized by virtue of certain symbols. Now, I've tried to classify this organization by using two types of symbols. What I call situational symbols, and secondly, what I call compositional symbols. Situational symbols, and here I will move away from the microphone for just a moment. Situational symbols, which you can see here, that are S1, S2, S3, those are, oh, thank you. Oh, that's great. Yeah. So S1, S2, and S3, those are symbols which are actually link the main actors. If you think in an anime series, or if you want in a work of manga, how those actors are related to a particular event or situation, or if you want, a narrative. How do they relate? How are they connected to the narrative in some way? And the great opposition that we see is that between protagonists and antagonists. Quite often the structure of manga and many other, of course, stories is based on this. So these emerge, but we have to understand how are these different characters related to the narrative. That's the first thing, the situational symbols. The second set of symbols, S4 to S6, the compositional symbols, those are the symbols that make the audience understand how the actors are related to each other. So how do we understand the relationship between antagonist and protagonist in the narrative and the way in which it's structured? And it's only in this way, I want to argue, that we can understand how symbols and how narratives emerge out of images and how audiences understand these. I'm going to turn this off to avoid this. Yeah, it's okay. For now, I'll use this one. I'll turn it on after. Thank you. So essentially, this is how I want to argue the symbolic structure of images is organized. Now, one of the key things that comes about when one thinks about images this way is that there is the creation of what we could call symbolic conventions, or if you want, patterns of meaning that are repeated over time. So that it is the case that when we as audiences look at images, we understand that they mean something, not only because the image appears to us for the first time, but because it reminds us of similar images which are inserted in similar narrative structures that we're familiar with from the past. So this means that the creators of images in manga or anime are very much aware of this. In part, what they do is they try to echo past narrative structures, past symbolic structures, in order to help audiences understand what those creators are trying to do, what they're trying to do and make mean. So the meaning of an image is often, and this is one sees this a lot in manga and anime, is not simply self-referential. It's not simply by looking at the symbolic structure that we understand it, but it's also through a process of what we could call historically derived analogical juxtaposition. Now, I don't think that's actually in the written version of the paper, so I wrote this down. So, historically derived analogical juxtaposition. So how does this work? Well, as you can see from the slide, this is taking, of course, from Akira, which you're all familiar with, the slide on the bottom. And part of it is that the echoing, the symbolic echoing of the beginning of Akira with what the mushroom cloud from Hiroshima is something that is echoing within the Japanese imaginary, that has a very strong historical echo. This is something that, of course, all of you are familiar with. But the key point here is that one needs to understand the idea of contextualization. When anime and when manga is read by audiences outside of Japan, although they may understand that this tries to echo what happened at Hiroshima, the kind of symbolic resonance, the type of historical memory that is triggered may be very different than that which audiences in Japan have. So the point is, this kind of historical analogy, this juxtaposition with the past, is something that varies by context very deeply. And so it is not the case that we can say that the meaning that exists with Japanese audiences will necessarily be the same as that which exists in other situations, in other contexts. So we can call this a process of creative adaptation. How is it that audiences in other settings, historical settings, or other, let's say, social cultural settings, understand the kind of juxtaposition that the creators of manga or anime are trying to make? Are they rereading, are those audiences overseas rereading the meaning, inserting them into narratives of trauma or war with which they are more familiar, and then re-signifying what these images mean? And that's a very interesting and I think fascinating question for this kind of research that's going on. Now, there's a great deal more that could be said about this. Of course, I can show you, again, another, the famous opening from Akira again, and the aftermath of the bombing from the ground from Hiroshima. Again, a kind of echoing, a very strong echoing. And what I was wondering, of course, and this is a kind of interesting and perhaps open question, is, after, in a kind of post-Fukushima Japan, then what is the meaning of Akira? Because as you all know, it begins with an explosion at a nuclear power plant, and it becomes this post-apocalyptic narrative. Going back to this story, does it appear to presage what happened in Fukushima? Is there a rereading now of this story, of this manga, of the narrative of the manga, based on what happened in Fukushima? Now again, there's a great deal to say about this, but given time, I want to move to, having talked about symbolic structure, I want to move to the next concept, which is that of network of circulation. So, one of the things I want to talk about here is that we have to take seriously the idea of the materiality of objects, of a manga, of anime. We have to understand how they are created through various stages. And so what I want to do here, I'm going to turn on this mic. What I want to do is to talk about... Okay, so I want to talk about how the networks of circulation actually operate when we talk about manga. And I'm going to do this very quickly, or in the case of anime. But what I've tried to divide